Hey folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Proctor, and today I want to talk a little bit about writing an academic paper on Lafferty. This is what's kept me from going on with the Past Master project, going through chapter by chapter and so on. And here I just want to reflect semi-randomly about writing that paper, what it's about, some things I discovered that I didn't even get to talk about in the essay, and things like that. The essay was written for a forthcoming collection of essays called Doppelgänger Gothic, edited by Simon Bacon. It's going to come out from Palgrave. My contribution is currently titled Good Weather for Gory Doppelgängers, Eco-Monstrous Doubles, Eidolons, and Fetches in 3 Tales by R.A. Lafferty. Now, I partly want to reflect semi-randomly on this because I didn't want to go back and read over the paper and then try to present, a synopsis of what I said there. Partly because, man, when you finish one of these things, you need distance from it. It was really hard to let it go and say, this is it, this is the final edit, the final draft, at least for now, to submit to the editor. And then, of course, I'll get feedback from the editor and an outside reader, and I'll probably change some things. But for now, I need that distance. And also, I just wanted to see what I might say about the stories and about the process and stuff that comes to me as a sort of afterglow or what have you. So to begin with, I wonder if Lafferty fans realize how often Lafferty involves doppelgängers or doubles in various forms. A common one being the fetch, which is from Irish folklore, and it's a double, but it's called a fetch in Ireland, or previously in Ireland, and it probably has probably each culture's version of the double has some unique qualities to it. But of course, Lafferty would have been engaging with Jungian archetypes and that kind of thing, although as far as I've been able to see, Jung doesn't seem to specifically deal with the double or the doppelganger anywhere, whereas Freud, I think, whom I haven't read much of besides his essay, The Uncanny, but Freud, I think, brings them up from time to time. But Lafferty, when talking about doubles or doppelgangers in his fiction, occasionally brings up Jung's name, and specifically in one place alludes to Jung saying that the unconscious manifests as a sort of splintering of the consciousness. And that's where Lafferty gets one of his story titles, Splinters, which is one of the stories I looked at. Anyway, one of the main places this all comes up is the Argo mythos, which the main book of which is The Devil is Dead. That's the one most people know, but it also comes up in the last book of that, More Than Melchizedek. Basically, 2 figures in that series have doppelgangers. Well, 2 main figures. There are others as well. There's doubles of various sorts with various characters. But 2 of the main ones being Finnegan and Melchizedek Duffy. And it just does really strange things with like sort of multiple lives on multiple timelines and stuff like that, and sort of a who created who type thing. And I had initially wanted to kind of at least briefly nod toward that, maybe outline it as a sort of framework for looking at doppelgangers in these short stories. But man, when you write an academic essay, there's just no space. You have to compact everything into the tiniest possible space. They range from like 6,000 to 8,000 words, and for me, that is just nothing. That is just working with almost nothing. You can't say anything in 6,000 to 8,000 words, which is why I found writing about these things easier actually in my dissertation, which could be 100,000 words, which I still struggled to fit everything into that framework. And maybe that's why I haven't written about Lafferty in an academic essay up to this point, which I was kind of surprised to realize. I think this will be maybe my 4th academic essay, like sort of peer-reviewed academic essay that's going to be published. And all the previous ones have been about sort of eco-monstrous poetics generally, or Hellboy films. One of them was about, several now on Stephen Graham Jones's fiction, all of which I'm happy to have done, and I'm glad as part of the sort of like mosaic that I'm slowly putting together of how to deploy eco-monstrous poetics and things like that. But this is the first peer-reviewed academic essay I've written on Lafferty's fiction specifically. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad that I waited. I feel a little more confident, within reason, approaching it at this point. And really, it's not even about confidence. It's just that I have a better grip maybe on some of my theoretical material, and more to say, I think, now about Lafferty and his fiction. But I had to, compact anything I did want to say into this very brief space, which means basically at some point you have to get rid of all your scaffolding, all your, this thread connects to this thread, and so on and so on. And you just have to make these leaps and hope that the reader will make those leaps with you. And it's a tricky business, and I've read essays that I thought did this really well and ones that I thought didn't do it so well, and I hope maybe I'm at least somewhere in between. and making those leaps also means that at some point, or at least in the type of sort of theoretical discourses that I'm trying to engage and deploy, at some point it kind of means you have to come out and be an original thinker, theorist, philosopher. It's inevitable. You have to sum up so much of what you've been looking at and deploy it in this unique way toward this particular fiction and this topic and so on, that you just end up having to out and out say, practically on your own authority, here is an idea. And yeah, that's intimidating. But one of the things about Lafferty's fiction that is simultaneously so sort of fruitful or productive, but also complicating, is that his fiction is already replete with its own theoretical discourse. Lafferty has so much philosophy and theology and all-round general theory built into his fiction, both implicitly and explicitly, so that to try to bring in, other critical discourses from literary theory or philosophy or whatever is very difficult. It's already too crowded. So how do you wedge in some more commentary, to apply some eco-critical reading or materialist reading or what have you? So it makes writing about Lafferty exciting and frustrating. Also, what makes that space difficult for me is I very much prefer to do, not completely, but frequently, close readings of the fiction under discussion, but in which I need to actually quote, often block quote sections of that fiction so that we can all look at it together and say, look, here's the thing. Because that's something I find frustrating about academic writing, about literature in particular, is many people just generalize about whatever the story or novel or poem or whatever is, and then do a lot of discussion around that. And the discussion can be great and it can be insightful, but it still just leaves the main topic is, I guess it depends on the kind of thing you're writing, but generally speaking, in literary criticism, it seems to me that the main topic should be the literature. So I like to, get in there and say, let's look at this together, and let's use its own terminology, et cetera, et cetera. And to do so just takes up more space and leaves me less room to, say the theoretical things I want to say. And, time will tell, but so far I think that approach is kind of working for me. Certainly at least one of my recent essays has gone through the whole process now of feedback and everything and is going to print, and that's the zombie one on Stephen Graham Jones's Zombies, where I did a lot of that kind of thing, though not nearly as much as I wanted to. And I'm waiting to hear back on two more essays, one of them being this Lafferty one. So we'll see how that goes. And sorry if you hear a rumbling noise, somebody's doing some work outside. So I didn't have space to bring in that sort of larger background of Lafferty and doppelgangers, and just had to jump into these stories for their own sake. But that's the amazing thing too, is that just these doppelgangers and doubles of various kinds, straight ahead doppelgangers as we might think of them, a double of oneself, happens a number of times in Lafferty's stories, and then just all kinds of other more general doublings and twinnings and that kind of thing you could look at in Lafferty. I'm sure you can think of some examples, and even just things I wanted to bring in just to mention briefly, like the series about Ostro and the Men Who Knew Everything, collected in Through Elegant Eyes. There's a phrase that Lafferty uses there that I think he uses in a few other places, but he uses it repeatedly in that sort of cycle of stories that relate to each other and have the same set of characters, same cast of characters, but where he says that characters have a schizo gash down the middle of them or something along those lines. and deals with that with several characters, but the main recurring character is a ghost girl called Mary Mondo, who's the sort of schizo-gash personality of a dead girl called Violet Lonsdale. You know, you can, even to just try to gesture toward that, you have to explain so much about that cycle of stories. And Lafferty, that's that frustration and excitement. It's like, oh, this will be a great reference, but there's no way you can even understand this reference unless I kind of set it up and what it's all about. So Lafferty's complex in that way. It makes it difficult but fun. But I couldn't even include that stuff. I think I may have gotten one mention of it in there. But so what I did engage then, the 3 stories I looked at were Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, which is collected in Strange Doings, which is the collection that came out after, just a few years after the famous seminal collection 900 Grandmothers, and it's a little better known amongst Lafferty fandom readership. So a fair number of people have read that one, and it's the most glaring example of a doppelganger double story, like straight up. I also looked at a story called Splinters that's collected in an anthology called Shadows that was edited by Charles Grant, and you can see he's collected alongside Stephen King, and there's like Robert Bloch and Ramsey Campbell and great horror authors that Lafferty's name is next to in the late 70s, which is so cool and is not the only time that happened. And the other story is called Cabrito, which is collected in this pretty obscure collection called Iron Tears. And I think it also came out in a little booklet that was 2 stories, Funny Fingers and Cabrito. So I don't think that many people have read that one or Splinters, because this is the only place that Splinters exists, is in this, you know, probably semi-obscure horror anthology from the late 70s. And originally I had pitched just writing about Cabrito because I had done sort of, 1,500 words on that in my thesis, and I was going to expand on that. And then I couldn't resist the pull of a couple more stories dealing with doppelgangers. And the thing is, that story, Cabrito, is only something like 1,500 words, less than 2,000 words itself. But it is so jam-packed. I mean, it's unbelievable how much is going on in that very, 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 very short story. And there's a lot of approaches you could take to it, not only sort of eco-critical, psychological, what have you. But I felt that breadth would demonstrate what Lafferty's doing with doppelgangers a little better than sheer depth on just this one story. So I brought in the others. We'll see how that goes with the editor, since that's not exactly what I proposed. But this usually happens with, you know, when you pitch what you're going to write, and then the finished product is often very, very different. But so in the story Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, that's Camels and Dromedaries, Clem. There's a salesman who has this little habit of going away from the hotel he's staying at in some town where he's doing business and phoning that hotel and asking for himself just to make sure that he's registered there so that he doesn't miss any phone calls while he's there. And in this case, they actually put him through to somebody, and somebody picks up the phone in his room, and he hears his own voice, and he knows it's his own voice, and he knows even by the way it reacts in this annoyed way that is totally him. He's like, oof, I didn't realize I sound that bad. But in that way, the doppelganger suddenly manifests. Now, what's fascinating to me about Lafferty and doppelgangers, now, this is not necessarily the case in every instance, but he makes, for an eco-critical reading, he makes this extremely strange move where when a human is doubled, suddenly non-humans proliferate in that phenomenon. Now, I'm going to have to go and study the Argo cycle, Devil is Dead and all that, to see how much that's the case in those. I didn't, sort of glancing through it, I didn't notice that it was so much, but in these short stories, it's very much the case. And you can see just from the title of this story that how animals are involved. Camels and Dromedaries, Clem. They're right there in the title, and Clem is the name of this salesman. And in this story, it's more of a notional thing about non-human animals, in that no actual animals feature in the story, but they frame it because right at the beginning of the story he's saying these things like camels and dromedaries, Clem, and samoyeds and malamutes, Clem, galena and molybdenite, which is fascinating. There's things when you go back to these stories that you're like, oh, I never even realized that. This whole time I'd always thought it was that he listed out all these pairs of animals that kind of look alike or are of a similar species or species type or something. But in fact, he gets into like minerals and maybe a couple other non-human things as well, in addition to just non-human animals. But that sort of chat is right at the beginning of the story without explanation, and then it goes through, and then it comes back to that sort of dialogue at the end with three characters, the two Clems, Clem and his doppelganger and their wife, all kind of saying these pairs of animals or other non-humans. And the reason they're doing that is to inspire this human doubling that has happened, for it to happen again with the wife, because initially she says, you two have to get back together, and they're like, we have a better idea, why don't you split apart, and then we'll be two couples and go our separate ways. And as they're like feeding her, because they had lost a bunch of weight, and then, or when they split, they like lost half their weight, and so they're trying to get her to double her weight so that she can then split. And they start saying, just think of pairs, think of divisions. Like, look at that like little paradox there, both pairs and divisions, which is what a double is, what a doppelganger is. And already Lafferty's being quite interesting about just naming the phenomenon of doppelganger, that it's both a pairing and a division. But at the end, they are naming out all these other things: crocodiles and alligators, butterflies and moths, mosses and lichens, again, more than just animals, and all that kind of thing, as they're saying, like, think about this and, split apart. And as you would guess from a Lafferty story, and this is spoilery, so I guess skip this if you don't want to spoil the story. And again, I've always said that Lafferty's not all that spoilable, but over and over again, I keep running into, especially short stories, that are like, well, that's a little bit spoilable. So he does have kind of those moments. In most of them, the ending seems almost inevitable, but he keeps you guessing, and you're like, but is it going to end that way? Or in even the details of some kind of, in this case, and often the case, grisly ending, you're like, but how is it going to be grisly exactly? And this is all implied. There's almost no gore described, but it is implied that her trying to split into two just makes a gory mess of things. Hence my title, Good Weather for Gory Doppelgangers. And so, what in the world is Lafferty doing with all these non-humans involved in the human doubling? But part of it is just simply that he just complicates things and makes our sense of life, existence, biology, and so on appropriately strange, weird, and particularly crowded and multiplicitous, so that when we have this sense of a human doubling, we're getting a sense of non-humans doubling and sort of exponentially at doubling, suggesting, of course, that even at our most human, in like human psychology and what it is and what it does with the unconscious and the conscious, we are connected to the more than human world. And he is getting some of this from Jung. From what I've been able to see, Jung definitely had an idea of there being layers of consciousness within our own consciousness and unconsciousness, and the collective unconsciousness that includes the non-humans and the consciousness that life itself has had from the basic form upward of some form or another, that you can peel away those layers and get to the consciousness of worms or something like that, is something he said. And you can see that in Lafferty big time, particularly think of the story All But the Words. But I also think that Lafferty's being a little more Native American about it, or resonant with Native American views about it, in that, as the Native American author Vine Deloria points out in his book, C.G. Jung and the Sioux Traditions, Dreams, Visions, Nature, and the Primitive, that where he finds a lot of overlap between Native views and Jung, and he likes him for that reason, but also Jung had a lot of problematic language about primitives and so on. But furthermore, that Jung kind of kept all the animals and the animal imagery and the non-humans and all that on the inside. It was an interior thing, and it was about our psychology and its symbols and these things. Whereas, as Deloria points out, sure, it does that kind of work, but for Native Americans, it's also about the actual animals out there and our relationships with them in various ways. And I think Lafferty is a little more along those lines, so that when he mentions all these species and different types of minerals or whatever it may be, he's naming all these real things. He's not just sort of naming like these big symbols, the lion, the bear. He's like, specifically naming kind of species of dog or whatever it may be, getting down to those like biological facts and details. And they're not given any obvious symbolic import or signal here. And that's what makes it like a little confusing. Like, why are they even here? But that's the beautiful thing. They're just here. They don't have to have a reason. They don't have to have a reason that conforms with our human needs and psychology and so on. but they are part of us and we are part of them. So that's a little bit of the kind of thing I think Lafferty is doing with doppelgangers. Well, here's one of the things I didn't get to talk about at all in that essay because it just wasn't the topic. But I have been so blown away lately going back to Lafferty and looking at him in detail with reading through Past Master more closely and now looking at these short stories. It's not always the case. Lafferty does have stories that are less complex than others, that are, at least for Lafferty, comparatively straightforward, or that maybe are just like not as artistically rich and accomplished as some of the other stories. It's not that like every single thing he ever wrote is this pure work of pure genius, although there's a lot of that. But in the case of these three stories, all three, I was just blown away by the craftsmanship and artistry of his writing as a writer, as a literary producer. It just blew my mind. Mainly what I mean here is that Lafferty has this way of compact storytelling and writing that is truly, for me, pretty mind-boggling, because he just, generally speaking, just doesn't do what any other writer does. All writers take their time and tell a story. They lay it out. They give you the details of a person's life, of their day, of, they show, don't tell, what kind of person they are and all this kind of thing. And it's tricky to say what Lafferty does and doesn't do here. You want to say Lafferty doesn't do any of that. It's partly that he leaves some of that aside and just doesn't do that kind of work and does something different. And it's partly that he does do that kind of work in this unexpected way. And I'm not here going to actually try to get into the details of exactly how he does that. And maybe, request it if you want it. Maybe I will try. That's where things get really scary, when you try to show what Lafferty's doing absolutely in detail in his writing. And many people have floundered trying to do that, but I'm willing to give it a try. And I think I can say some things on that. But the point is that as I looked through and tried to sort of pull out extracts and comment on different things in all three of these stories, but let's just say in Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, I found that Lafferty had, as he often does, he had just sort of put together a series of set pieces about this guy in his life that were not specifically joined up. And even the set pieces themselves left so much unsaid and implied, both in terms of just the sheer action and what's going on, and your mind very quickly fills in the details, and in terms of themes and things. And so when he's having the main character talk to a psychoanalyst about this issue, or they have a conversation with his wife, from whom he's now estranged because she's living with the double, that kind of thing. It's just so compact, and it leaves out so much so that it feels completely pregnant with meaning. And it makes for this really rich, almost ornate, without meaning to be ornate, without particular ornament, story. It means it's this object that you can just go back to and go back to and go back to with all its facets. And the term I kept thinking of, and I had to look it up to see, is that an even appropriate term? I don't know what this is, but it's these stories are each a little tesseract, and just a many-dimensional, sort of object. And I don't mean interdimensional, I just mean all the dimensions of this particular object, and this art object, the story, and the way it works. And I really think this is what elevates Lafferty's writing to literature and to great literature. I haven't seen a ton of this kind of thing elsewhere, and where you see it really is in the James Joyces and the Virginia Woolfs or Thomas Pynchons or whoever. And these stories in particular really made me think of some stories that I've read, stories sort of the uncanny like this, by E.T.A. Hoffman and Alexander Pushkin, and indeed reminds me also of Jorge Luis Borges, all of which have a similar storytelling through elision in part, packing a fairly short story with a whole lot going on, and certain sort of built-in levels of undecidability about it. And within science fiction, I think one of the main people many think of as doing this would be Gene Wolfe, and that's certainly true, but I find the level at which Lafferty is doing this to be a little more robust and frankly accomplished than what I see in Gene Wolfe. And I do think that Gene Wolfe is a little bit more of an engineer about it than Lafferty, though they both were trained as engineers, and Lafferty certainly brings that to his fiction as well. And where Gene Wolfe is, favorable to obviously the literary, to the mystical, I think, and other things like this, I'm not sure that he himself is a mystic or a visionary. I know some would disagree, but I think he's good at channeling that stuff, and he probably has maybe elements of that. But whereas Lafferty is like, it's not even something he can switch off, and this is something that Wolfe said about Lafferty, more or less. But Lafferty is just bringing that all the time. And speaking of like doppelgangers and psychology and stuff, Lafferty is just, I think, more willing to let the unconscious do a lot of overt work within a story that then he's such a good craftsman about. He can massage it and make it beautiful and solid and just something, as I say, you can go back to and go back to. And the thing about Lafferty is he's constantly hiding all this literary depth in what look like simple stories. So like amongst these early collections of Lafferty, I always have these stories that I think are just, wow, oh my gosh, and the ones that are like, oh, that was really cool. It's a secondary story, but yeah, really nice. And I always thought of Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, as one of those sort of secondary stories. And in some ways I still do, I guess maybe more out of taste or something. But as I dug into it, I was like, this is as thick and thorny and just literary as anything else, as, continued on Next Rock or something, like a wow story from this collection. And as I wrote about it, I couldn't even touch on so much of what Lafferty was doing. Like he's like really getting into psychology and talking about psychologists taking a photograph and cutting it in half and putting that up to the mirror, and you get two different faces and all, I couldn't even get into that stuff. I had to like crisply move on with my point or whatever. So it's like when you write about Lafferty, you've just scratched, it's like, you can't tick anything off. Oh, I wrote about that story. Psh, you wrote about 1/100th of what that story is about, and you can go back to it anytime and get way more. And of course, the exciting thing is if Lafferty Studies ever properly takes off. I used to call it like an infant sort of field, but I don't know, man. I'm not sure this infant's going to make it. It's so tiny and doesn't seem to be developing. But should it ever take off, it's an endless source. It's just an endless source for academic and, whatever else we want to do with it. In the story Splinters, he likes to sort of diversify how he's working with the doppelganger. And so I don't know that he ever calls it a double or a doppelganger in Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, whereas he calls it that directly in like the Argo cycle. And here he wants to diversify and call it an eidolon, E-I-D-O-L-O-N, which is just sort of an ideated manifestation of a person or thing. But of course this is Lafferty, so these have physical properties. Mainly in the end, they're basically soap bubbles, human-shaped soap bubbles. But that's their like core material makeup, but within that they can reproduce everything about the particular human of which they are an eidolon, such as their fingerprints and stuff, so that he talks about, if you found one of these eidolons in the morgue, you would identify it as that person until the living person comes along and says, no, I'm here, I'm still alive. And you're like, well, what was that? And eventually these things dissipate like the soap bubbles that they are. And that is what I just said is like is hardly explained in the story, and is not the point of it, and is not like a big discourse about the story. Like that's what, as is often said, Lafferty takes, these sort of science fictional or speculative ideas that most people would turn a whole, story or book, they would make the whole story or book about that. And he just like tosses it in there. Yeah, here's one thing we're working with, and then goes on with his story. But in a good way. I'm gonna have to talk about this at some point, because I've been reading some more science fiction lately, and there is a habit of some writers to like toss in all these SF kernels. And there's a way in which that can be really bland, because nothing gets really worked out or expanded, and so it's not very rich. And I suppose you could make that complaint about Lafferty, but I don't hear anybody saying that about Lafferty, and it's certainly not my complaint, because it just works in a different way, because there's still these like really lovely ideas that you can contemplate if you want to, and that still do a reasonable amount of work in the story in the way that there are. And this is, again, part of my fresh awe at Lafferty's writing, this way that he is able to, well, I just keep calling them, he puts these like tokens into a story, these like fictional tokens, whether that's characters or events or whatever else, and he just places them there, and they do all this work. They're so dense. They just sit there and do the work that they need to do. I mean, as someone who tries to write fiction himself from time to time and has done for years, it feels very unfair that Lafferty has this ability to just magically set all this stuff in place. He's like a wizard. You know, I think people will say that about Wolfe and others, but I think Wolfe's wizardry is more that of the careful, occult practitioner who has to use a lot of rules and things, whereas Lafferty's is more like some, you know, primordial being or something that just has these powers flowing through him or something. But in the story Splinters, instead of just someone having a double, there's a whole series of doubles carrying on about. And the whole thing is, in this case, the non-humans that this is all tied to is mainly weather. And that's the first eidolon that shows up, is they sort of, a group of men summon this eidolon of a local weatherman. This is so Lafferty. I love that. You know, it's like, you could have doubles and summonings of eidolons in so many weird, creepy, awesome ways, and involving, you know, all kinds of characters. But it's a local weatherman because they want to know the weather for that night, because they want to go on this late night fishing expedition, and they need to know which kind of weather it's going to be so they can decide which lake they want to go to and which kind of fish, or otherwise, because they talk about turtles, they want to try to catch in which kind of method. And this is again, like right at the beginning of the story, the way there's this at the advent of a double of the humans, non-humans proliferate, and you're just like surrounded by all this thought of like he names like real Oklahoma lakes and real species of fish and real methods of fishing and so on. And of course the weather, as you're just trying to have this like weird psychological manifestation of the unconscious in the form of a double. And again, there's a meeting with a psychoanalyst that is really compact and does all this work and is really strange, and like some things are just not fully stated, so that as you work at what's happening, you're like, I think this is what's happening, but I'm not totally sure. But it seems as if, well, it's very clear that the woman who seeks the psychoanalyst, eventually it's seen that she's talking to the eidolon, the double of that psychoanalyst, rather than the psychoanalyst himself. Or yeah, and it's not entirely clear whether it's her own double that's talking to him or herself. I was never clear on that. And furthermore, there's this like weird thing where she enters in through this side door that she's never seen before, and then she's on this couch that seems too small, but she fits it, and all these implications that imply, it says like it's doll-sized, and this is why I think maybe she's an eidolon too, that they are both like these diminutive doubles of the original people. Oh, so good. And just all these ways in which Lafferty performs sort of disorientation that is, again, fruitful and productive. It's not like disorientation for its own sake, but what it is for is a little bit difficult to name. But at the very least, I think one of the things it takes something like Jungian psychology, which, you know, from what I've been able to see so far, seems a little too, or maybe a lot too, schematic and programmatic, you know, and he's so into these archetypes and different things. And this is where you get Joseph Campbell and the hero with 1,000 faces and all this stuff that, you know, it can be taken so far that it's like, okay, we've got everything locked. It's like this big, vast board game with all the pieces, and we know how it all works, and we've got all the cards with all the rules. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of nominal diversity and drama going on here, but all within these really well-defined, very, very set patterns and so on. And Lafferty's fiction just makes that really, really messy, again, in a useful way. That sort of reminds us that the patterns we think are there may not be the patterns that we think they are, or that have the full scope that we think they have, which can help with everything from, you know, individuals being individuals to different ethnic groups being different ethnic groups, and these sorts of things, rather than sort of whitewashing it all with this one theory that will rule them all. But a really haunting element of Lafferty's story, Splinters, is that in the end, a woman, again, spoiler, a woman is pushed off a building by her own doppelganger. She had meant to push her doppelganger off on live television to make a big show of her death and then show up in the studio alive and wow everybody. but it went the other way around. And so who shows up in the studio is the double, the eidolon, who slowly, again, this is more implied than really shown, but slowly dissipates as the soap bubble that it is in front of live television. And it gets really weird, man. There's, again, when you go back to these things, there's things you never noticed, but like the whole ending of this story is a news report. It starts as one, like a news anchor telling the story of what happened the night before with the woman falling from the building and stuff. And I really like got into this and started to imagine it as like the movie Network or something, and watching, like if you made a movie of this story and you're just watching this guy on camera and you don't move from it, you just show him telling about this woman jumping from a building and stuff, and how he gets into her voice and all this kind of stuff. It's really cool and weird and kind of a little bit Lynchian, maybe Twin Peaks-ish. And then that TV report becomes like a panel of experts commenting on this horrible tragedy, which is something Lafferty does in other stories as well. But here it's on television. But beyond all the doppelganger stuff, the central weird moment of this story is that the doppelganger, in this way that is really hard to make sense of, but is definitely deliberate, seems to take the place of her original, who has fallen, in the form of a disembodied voice, a disembodied scream. Because when the original, the woman, had gone to push her doppelganger off, she told her to keep screaming on the way down. But of course it was the woman who was pushed off and the doppelganger who survives. But then the doppelganger is like, oh yeah, she said keep screaming, and then takes on that role as she dissipates. And so that now they hear from that tall building this constant scream over and over again. The sound of her falling all that way and screaming stops and starts again over and over endlessly. And he says that there's like other phenomena like this in the world, and that like in some other city they have a famous screamer or something, but it's just become part of, as he says, the industrial noise of the city at this point, and nobody notices it anymore. Whoa. And just like thinking about that eco-critically and stuff. And he's asking like, will we ever get used to this scream? And in this story, one of the characters says it's good weather for eidolons this week. And that's why I said good weather for gory doppelgangers. And just this, as I was looking at it, it actually became kind of poignant about our moment, where there's this sense of the non-human environment and non-human forces like weather and so on meshing with the human and with our psychology, and projections of our own unconscious and our collective unconscious coming out in ways that we can't deal with and we don't deal with properly. And when we try to sort of betray those unconscious parts of ourselves, they in turn betray us and leave sort of fragments of our minds screaming in the industrial landscape as we can't cope with what's going on with the whole of the non-human world and forces and things. And it just became this strange parable of what it was like to live through COVID and so on, and more generally our environmental moment. And as I said, I haven't reread the paper so that I could like say that more concisely for you. Hopefully it makes a little bit of sense and provokes some thoughts. But again, I was just blown away by the writing and how much he had packed into this story, and how the fruitful ambivalences of it keep you coming back and coming back. And lastly, I wrote about Cabrito, as I've said, and this is wonderful little southwestern tale that he wrote very early on, one of his first stories that he wrote, and it goes really well with another early story called The Wagons that no one has read. But in this case, it just says like this Airman Lundquist is the main character, and it says that he's Norwegian American from Minnesota, I think, but he's down in a border town just past the border in America, in Mexico, and I think we're to kind of assume it's Texas-Mexico border, and he's with another character just called the Irishman. And there's this whole thing with female characters in that one that is so strange and that I just really couldn't get into, because so the main character, the Norwegian guy, has two doppelgangers, and they're called fetches in this case, and they're his mirror images. He's in Lafferty's just setting it up and doing so much work into such a small space. This is like literally a parable of how these stories work. They're in a bar, and the bar has wall-length mirrors on both sides, so that every person in the bar is tripled in view. And it even mentions that they're all drinking, the drinks are tripled. And he just mentions offhandedly that each of the mirror images was doing something slightly different than the Norwegian himself. They're each telling a slightly different story, which he gives a little glimpse of, and they're each drinking a different drink, a different cocktail, which he mentions. And he's like, except for that, they behaved as most mirror images do. And he says, you'll have guessed, of course, that these are fetches. But in the same way that this character is made into a doppelganger triplicity, there's this triplicity of female characters in it that I couldn't even get into, and there's this woman named right at the beginning who's not named again. It's so weird. And there's even like this whole thing with, because it's the Norwegian and the Irishman, but it says they're with two brown men as well. But then the whole thing, like you kind of leave off all these other characters and it just focuses on the Norwegian and the Irishman. But the wild thing he does there, and I have to think that he knows this, as I looked into the term fetch, it's actually, the Irish term comes from Old Norse and Old Norse mythology about fetches and so on into Ireland. And so it can't be a coincidence that he's got an Irishman and a Norwegian as the main characters. But it's the Norwegian who has the fetches. Anyway, this gets into a whole tale about eating goats and the Cabrito. Google that if you dare. It's a kind of a grotesque dish. Does sound yummy. But yeah, and like where did the goats come from? And these sort of three competing tales that can't all be true at once, it would seem, about where they come from, that this local woman storyteller is telling them at a different bar that they went to as they eat the cabrito, this whole roasted goat kid. And it ranges around from like the supernatural to the gory and so on as to where the goats are coming from. And again, you have, as the human is doubled or tripled in this case, you have this incredible proliferation of non-humans. The story is very much about goats and stuff, but also dogs and volcanoes and demons, cactus and what have you. So that basically for Lafferty, understanding the human conscious and unconscious can never be an anthropocentric thing. It can't just be about humans. It has to be about everything and everyone, and humans and non-humans. And out of these three stories, I'd probably say Cabrito is the best one. It's probably just got like the best writing, the best sentences. It is the most rich in literary and philosophical ideas. It's the most rich in like a multiplicitous storytelling and stories within stories, and probably the one you could dig around in and excavate the longest out of the three. But also, it's probably the most accomplished. It's the smoothest in a good way. Probably a higher quality gem of a story than the other two, though they proved to be incredibly great gems of stories. And I guess I will say briefly, in case anyone's interested, the sort of theory type stuff I drew on was mainly Lacanian psychoanalysis from Jacques Lacan, which I'm kind of new to, but I mean, he's one of these names you hear about all the time. And so I'd heard a lot about his, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And I tried to read up on that myself. But particularly I was using one guy's use of this, Stephen Swarbrick, in a recent work, was working with what he calls the environmental unconscious. And basically Lacan's psychoanalysis is built on this idea of a lack or gap or void and all these kinds of terms that is basically what makes us human subjects, what makes us individuals, is that we have to like separate from the totality, the real, in order to become this individuated thing. But then our whole life is built on this longing for, this desire for, this jouissance, this pleasure in sort of getting back to that real, but yet that it's not being part of it that makes us subjects. And so the real is both a surplus and a subtraction. It's everything that our imaginary and symbolic systems can't really take in and leaves out, but by being that surplus, that more, it creates holes, gaps in what we are, in our consciousness, in our culture, and so on. And Swarbrick argues that we need more poetics that honors those gaps and stuff to become less anthropocentric, instead of always trying a little too hard to be like, oh, everything's harmonious, everything is a holistic whole, we're all interrelated, and all that kind of thing, which is true, but not in necessarily the hippie way that we often think of it. Again, as I said with Lafferty, it's more messy than that, and it involves all these holes and things. And to poeticize those holes and gaps is to get a little closer to the real and to have a better mindset that can cope with what's going on ecologically, than to continue to be like, kind of anthropocentric in our sense of like, no, this all ties together all nice and neat, if we just do the right things. It makes us a little more humble and able to follow the vagaries and vicissitudes of ecological existence and coexistence. And I think that Lafferty's fiction generally, but these doppelganger stories in particular, display a similar poetics and achieve a similar end. So that's a handful of thoughts on that. And it was a great joy to write this article. It was hard, it was difficult. All writing of articles and essays is extremely difficult, not least when you're not getting paid for it. Sadly, these things don't pay. Somebody's getting paid somewhere in the publishing industry, but it's not the people who write the stories. They expect you to have a teaching job and so on, which I don't have, sadly, at this time. But in this case, the hard work really paid off in some joy of like engaging these stories at this level and hopefully writing a few interesting things about them that maybe one or two people will read in the future. And whilst I've written 3 articles in the past 6 months or something, which is a lot in that space of time, a whole lot. 4 articles actually, if I include a book review that was, a lot of effort as well, an academic book review. So I really need a break from these things. Hopefully that break will result in much more YouTube content, but there was enough joy in them, and especially in engaging this Lafferty, that there's definitely new ideas bubbling in the back of my brain, and I hope to write more, particularly on Lafferty in the future. Do consider having a look at my Patreon, patreon.com/Dr. Rockter. That's DOCTORROCKTER. Or you could probably just Google Daniel Otto Jack Peterson Patreon for a fair bit more content there and a variety of it. And just, consider supporting what I'm trying to do here. And let me know your thoughts on these stories if you've read them and anything else that I've talked about here. And let's get on with some more Lafferty discussion in the near future. Thanks for watching.